Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Arena, and this week we're going to be taking out a brand new deck for the best of threes. We're going to be looking at a mono blue wizard tempo list. So this is actually a deck that I stumbled across when I was building it, trying to do an enter the battlefield matters kind of deck, so basically a flicker deck. So I was building around quasi-duplicate and release to the wind as well. So quasi-duplicate creates a token that's a copy of a creature you control, and then you can actually jumpstart it, which means you can discard a card, cast it from your graveyard to do it all over again. So I saw this card, and I've done it once before with Murmuring Mystic, which is also in the deck as well for some sweet bird fun. But I wanted to try and actually make an Enter the Battlefield Matters deck, and this is kind of how this deck ended up being formed. We also have 3 copies of Release to the Wind as kind of the same situation, 3 mana, but 2 and a blue instead of the double blue for the quasi-duplicate, and instant speed. It says exile target non-land permanent, and for as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may cast it without paying its mana costs. So, essentially, what we can do is we can remove a creature from the game, let's say Exclusion Mage, and for as long as it remains in exile, it is completely free to cast at any time that we could cast it, and it basically gets its Enter the Battlefield effect once more. So that's kind of what we're going to go for with this list. So around that, I ended up adding in a fair few little cards. Like, I was like, ooh, maybe if we do Enter the Battlefield effects, maybe we want wizards because we've got Naban. And Naban is a 1 and a blue 2/1 that says if a wizard entering the battlefield under your control causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So if you remember Panharmonicon, it's essentially that for wizards. Any enter the battlefield, a trigger that goes on the stack is doubled if it is wizard related. So our entire deck from that point then turned into a wizard deck. So we obviously want to have things like Merfolk Trickster, which is 2 blue for a 2/2 with flash, which means we can cast it on our opponent's turn if we want, whenever we want. And it enters the battlefield and it taps a creature an opponent controls, and it loses all abilities until the end of the turn. So keep in mind, I'm not going to keep repeating myself, but Naban would double any single trigger that says enter the battlefield. So in the case of Merfolk Trickster, we would actually tap 2 creatures an opponent controls, which is a superb tempo swing. And for those who don't know what the actual kind of definition of a tempo deck is, it's essentially adding power to the board while also reducing power for your opponent. So we just incrementally gain slow amounts of advantage until we're just steamrolling away. So in the case of like Mono Blue Tempo, which is the deck right now that most people hate, it kind of gets a turn 1 threat down and then it protects it, and that makes it really annoying. What we do instead is we get a threat down, but then we make our opponent's threats less powerful because they're always tapped in the case of Merfolk Trickster, or they're unable to untapped in the case of Water Trap Weaver, which is essentially Merfolk Trickster but sorcery speed for 1 extra mana, and it stops them from untapping as well. So there is some use there. It's only going to be 1 copy because we're actually running 4 copies of Exclusion Mage as that kind of effect as well. Exclusion Mage is 2 and a blue for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you return target creature and opponent controls to its owner's hand. So bouncing creatures and forcing them to replay them is a really huge tempo swing for us, because we play a creature down and our opponent has to replay everything that they've already played before. So they're not really adding extra stuff to the board rather than just trying to get the stuff that they've already played back into play. So it's super annoying, and it also clears the way as well for all of our wizards to enter the field. We also have Silvergill Adept, which is a 2/1 for 2. However, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you have to reveal a Merfolk from your hand or pay 3. And its Enter the Battlefield effect is to draw a card, 2 with Naban. So we actually, as I mentioned, we are a wizard sub-theme, and Silvergill Adept is a Merfolk wizard, so you can reveal another Silvergill in your hand if you have one, but we can also reveal Merfolk Tricksters, we can reveal Water Trap Weaver, can also reveal Salvager of Secrets as well. So we do have plenty of merfolks. It turns out that a lot of merfolks are also wizards, so that really synergizes. So there's a wizard theme with a merfolk sub-theme underneath it. It's really tightly woven is this deck, to be honest. There aren't that many flex slots in this deck, but there are one or two, and I'll go through them eventually anyway. So, in addition to doing all of that stuff, I should probably mention Salvager of Secrets since I'm already hovering over it, because it is a fun little card, and you might be wondering why there's a 5-drop in my tempo list. So, 3 and 2 blue for a 2/2, which is really underpowered. However, Salvager of Secrets enters the battlefield. You may return a target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So, Salvager can actually return any number of things. If we're on 7 mana, we might want to bring back our Wizard's Retorts, because that allows us to then hold up a counterspell. The cost reduction for Wizards is fully in effect at that point. We could also bring in some other kinds of protection as well. We have 3 copies of Dive Down, 1 blue for an instant speed. You return target creature gets +0/+3 and hexproof until the end of the turn, so 1 mana protection spell for any one of our creatures should we need it. It can also bring back Release to the Wind and Quasi-Duplicate, and these ones are interesting because Salvager of Secrets bringing back Quasi-Duplicate in this particular instance actually means that you have Quasi-Duplicate, meaning 3 mana for a 2/2 every single turn for as many times as you can cast it. Because if you imagine, Salvager of Secrets enters the battlefield, we pick Quasi-Duplicate, putting it back into our hand. We then pay 3 to copy Salvager of Secrets, which makes a token that has the Enter the Battlefield trigger. And that trigger targets Quasi-Duplicate, bringing it back into our hand. And then we cast Quasi-Duplicate again, which the copy brings it back into our hands. So as long as we've got 3 mana and a resolving spell, we're going to be able to make 2/2s for the rest of the game just on Salvager of Secrets and Quasi-Duplicate alone. Now, Salvager is a wizard as well, so sometimes we actually get to bring back 2 instants and sorceries, so we could bring back Quasi-Duplicate, and we could bring down Dive Down and Wizard's Retort, and if you can imagine, just taxing 3 mana on our Salvager of Secrets in order to bring back a counterspell or 2 every single turn, guaranteed to be able to counterspell something every single turn. Well, that just locks out a lot of decks in the format. So, Salvager of Secrets, it is a 2-of because it is quite expensive and it is hard to get to, but it is also nice in our hand because it's a Merfolk that we can reveal to Silvergill. You know, we have that kind of late-game Merfolk that we can keep targeting to make sure that our Silvergills are constantly coming out for 2 mana. But also we have the late-game potential as well, being able to completely copy Swarm with Quasi-Duplicate, protect our spells, and make sure that we can close out the game with things like Wizard's Retort. On top of that, we have 2 copies of Murmuring Mystic, which is a human wizard. For 4 mana, it's a 1/5, which is a superb blocker, and honestly, it's mostly an auto-win against the Izzet Drakes deck. Looking at the Pro Tour list, I noticed that there aren't many ways that Izzet Drakes can actually deal with this card. 1/5 makes it very hard. You're going to need to 2/4, and we're not going to be playing this in the early game as well, so it's quite likely that they've been firing their lightning strikes and shocks off on our face just to get their phoenixes out. So the likelihood is that when Murmuring Mystic actually hits the ground, it's actually going to hit the ground with no removal in sight. And if you remember the budget birds deck that I built a while ago, then Murmuring Mystic combos really well with Quasi-Duplicate, because Murmuring Mystic, you copy it with Quasi-Duplicate, which triggers it to make a 1/1 bird illusion token, which will block any kind of Drake or Phoenix at that point. Izzet Drakes doesn't typically have a way of giving their Drakes any kind of evasion other than the flying, which is usually good enough in their books, but if we're making 1/1 blockers constantly, there's just no way they can get through. The only situation that would not be the case for would be Niv Mizzet, but I've actually had a Niv Mizzet game where I just Exclusion Mage and repeatedly Quasi-Duplicate Niv Mizzet out of there, so they draw 1 card, but they're constantly recasting Niv Mizzet, and they just can't get enough value making a 6-drop every single turn with us bouncing it back to their hand constantly and swinging with our Tricksters and things like that, so it is really useful there. So, yeah, being able to make as many bird tokens as we possibly can just blocks the Drakes constantly and allows us to get our slow amounts of 2/1s and 2/2s through the side of all of these creatures as they're trying to frantically get through our bird tokens. It's really quite funny. But yes, I think that's most of the deck. We do have our Wizard's Retorts as well, just as our occasional counter spell as well. Cost reduction allows us to counter spells. We can pull it back with Salvager. It is very, very useful. The final card in our deck that I haven't actually touched upon is Narumeha, Master Wizard. This is probably the meme card of the deck. This is probably the flex slot, I would say, though it has got some practical applications all the same. So Narumeha is 2 and 2 blue for a 3/3 with flash, so similar to the Merfolk Trickster, we can cast this whenever we want. And when she enters the battlefield, she gets to copy an instant or sorcery spell I control, and I may choose new targets for the copy. And then other wizards I control get +1/+1. So she is our Wizard Lord. We're only running 2 copies of her, because we actually don't need the Lord effect all that much. But it is useful to close out the game super quickly if she is there. What we could also use her for, though, is the ability to copy spells on the stack. So if we've Dive Down and they've removal spelled in response, we could Narumeha to copy the Dive Down to reapply the spell, something along that line. There is also a combo with Narumeha and Release to the Wind. I haven't managed to pull it off just yet, but it is an infinite combo that used to be bugged, so we'll have to see if it's still bugged. Narumeha enters the battlefield when Release to the Wind is on the stack, and she copies Release to the Wind, which Release to the Wind then exiles Narumeha. Narumeha comes back into play, and you copy the Release to the Wind on the stack, and you get to just constantly recast Narumeha forever. And while that doesn't have an application in the main deck, in the sideboard it actually does have an infinite life combo, because if we have Diamond Mare in play, 2 mana for a 1/3, as Diamond Mare enters the battlefield, choose a colour. Whenever you cast the spell of the chosen colour, you gain 1 life. So recasting Narumeha in this chain will gain us 1 life every single time we do it, effectively giving us infinite mana. Now, if we have Naban in play as well, her trigger is going to trigger twice, so we could copy Release to the Wind plus something else that's on the stack, maybe a quasi-duplicate, maybe copy Release to the Wind twice to bounce her and something else, maybe a Merfolk Trickster or an Exclusion Mage, so that we can infinitely bounce the board or something along that line. So that's something to keep in mind there. But yeah, let's go on to the sideboard, shall we? So what we have to do in our sideboard is to defeat the decks that we just struggle with. Now, against the Izzet Drake's deck, as I mentioned, Murmuring Mystic is pretty much an auto-win. They can't get through the bird tokens, and if you can generate enough of them with Murmuring Mystics and quasi-duplicates, the game is over. So we're actually filling the slots with extra copies of Murmuring Mystic. If you do come against Izzet Drakes, bring these 2 in, and then go for the budget birds plan of quasi-duplicating as many Murmuring Mystics as you possibly can. Because if you have 4 or 5 Murmuring Mystics, then a Dive Down's going to make you 4 or 5 bird tokens, which even Niv Mizzet cannot keep up with at that point. So, in addition to that, we also have problems with hexproof creatures and things like that. So we're actually running River's Rebuke as one of our solutions to things like Carnage Tyrant, which are hard to deal with, and the 4 mana 6/6 Nullhide Ferox, that's the one, and also Vine Mare as well. So we could bounce all of the hexproof stuff that we can't actually usually tap down or bounce with Tricksters and Exclusion Mages. So that's what River's Rebuke's in here for. We usually only need to clear the way once, so it is a really nice thing to do there. We can also bounce away Planeswalkers and pretty much everything. It is a bounce all permanence after all. We also have 2 copies of Tempest Caller for go-wide strategies as well, because sometimes we just can't quite tap enough stuff if they're running Saprolings or green-white tokens or anything like that then. Tempest Caller is a Merfolk Wizard, which synergizes very well with our deck again, for our Merfolk and Wizard theme. 4 mana for a 2/3, enters the battlefield, you tap all creatures target opponent controls, which allows us to Alpha Strike all the way through. And if we've been salvaging with Quasi-Duplicate, we have plenty of 2/2s to go swinging. So, likelihood is, when Tempest Caller comes down, we're probably going to be threatening lethal. We're also filling in a few spots as well. In the case where Wizard's Retort is especially effective, we have our 4th copy here. We also have Dive Down as well for removal heavy decks as well that we might end up seeing, just to fill that little slot in there, because Dive Down is very, very powerful, but some decks don't actually try to even remove your cards, which is why we're running 3 copies in the main board, and the spare in the side, just in case we do come against that matchup. We have Disdainful Strokes for big creature threats, but also for big mana spells as well. There's plenty in the green-black mid-range that Disdainful Stroke actually hits, so countering a spell with mana cost 4 or greater for 2 mana is quite useful. We're running 3 copies of that. And finally, we've got 1 copy of Spell Pierce as well. Yet again, it's one of those for the removal-heavy decks, just to make sure that our early-game threat sticks around. Counter-target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. We can also use this as kind of a gotcha card as well. If our opponent taps out in the late game for something big, then we can make them really regret the decision by forcing them to pay 2 when they absolutely cannot. So yeah, that's essentially the sideboard. I do hope you guys enjoy this list. It is a very, very difficult one to pilot, I would say. So this one isn't for the light-hearted. You do need to think about pretty much everything as you're going through, because you know, you have to tap down creatures that are going to be untapped the following turn, so you need to know when you have to tap them down or when to bounce them. Some decks have enter the battlefield abilities of their own, and they're attached to creatures that you don't want to bounce, so you've got to really weigh up the advantages and disadvantages of a lot of the plays that you make in this matchup. So yeah, it's not an easy one to play. But it is a super fun and honestly a super rewarding one as well. Whenever I win a game with this, you know, I have a warm fuzzy feeling inside because I've managed to defeat my opponent with this one. It is quite a fun. There's also actually one little annoyance with the deck that I should mention as well. Silvergill Adept plus Release to the Wind. So as I mentioned, Release to the Wind can flicker a creature out and you can cast it for free. However, Silvergill Adept does have this additional cost attached to it, which does apply even when Release to the Wind allows you to cast the card for free. So Silvergill Adept would be 0 mana with a 3 mana additional cost if you don't have a Merfolk in hand. So that's one interaction you have to keep in mind, and one that caught me off guard once before, and I didn't actually realise that that was actually going to be a thing. But yes, Release to the Wind and Silvergill Adept can be a little bit of a nombo at times, so be aware that when you are flickering your creatures around, some of them might not come back for free. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed anyway this deck tech, and if you did, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the little bell icon as well to get notifications when videos go live in the future. There'll be a link to the deck list down in the description below, as well as the match number 1, and at the end of this video as well, there'll be a link you can click to go straight to the first game of this series. I hope you've enjoyed, guys. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.